Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back, my daughter-in-law said, her voice smooth and almost polite, as if she were reminding me to take out the trash instead of erasing me from my own home. My son didn't look at me. He just nodded, eyes fixed on his plate, cutting his steak into neat, careful pieces like nothing had just been said. I remember noticing how steady his hands were. Not a tremor. Not a pause. That was the moment I understood this wasn't sudden. This had been decided long before tonight. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I simply placed my napkin beside my plate, folded it once, and stood up. The chair made a soft scraping sound against the hardwood floor, louder than it should have been in that suffocating silence. Neither of them tried to stop me. I walked upstairs, each step measured, my hand gliding along the banister my husband had polished every spring for over 30 years. The house felt different already. Colder. Like it had chosen a side. In the bedroom, his scent still lingered faintly on the pillow. Cedar and aftershave. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around at a life that had taken 4 decades to build. Photographs lined the dresser. Vacations, birthdays, quiet Sundays that used to mean something. I didn't cry. The tears had come earlier that week, at the funeral, when the ground swallowed the only person who had ever truly stood between me and the rest of the world. Now there was just a quiet emptiness, settling in like dust. I opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. The same one we had used for our last trip to Vermont. I packed slowly. A few dresses. My coat. The jewelry box he had given me on our 25th anniversary. I left most things behind. Furniture. Dishes. Even the framed photos. They didn't belong to me anymore. Not in the way that mattered. By the time I came back downstairs, they were still at the table. Olivia glanced up briefly, then back at her wine glass. Daniel didn't move. I walked past them, suitcase rolling softly behind me, and reached for my keys on the entryway table. For a second, my hand hovered over the surface, remembering how many times I had stood there waiting for him to come home, how many evenings I had believed this was a place of safety. Then I picked them up and walked out. The night air was cool, crisp against my skin. I didn't look back. Not once. I drove without a destination, the headlights cutting through empty streets, my thoughts quieter than they had any right to be. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. Silver hair, tired eyes, but something else too. Something steadier than before. By the time I reached the small motel off Route 9, I had already made a decision. I checked in under my name, Margaret Hayes, and when the young clerk handed me the key, he smiled politely, unaware that the woman standing in front of him had just been erased from her own family. The room was simple, clean, temporary. I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, just like I had done hours earlier, but this time the silence felt different. Not empty, not hollow, just waiting. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For years, I had woken up to make breakfast for a house that no longer wanted me. This time, I got dressed without rushing. Navy coat, low heels. The pearl earrings he used to say made me look put together. I took my time. Then I picked up my purse and walked out. The bank opened at 9. I was there at 8:45. When the doors unlocked, I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished floors and paper greeting me like an old memory. The teller looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," she said, recognizing me instantly. Of course she did. I had been coming here for years. Signing documents. Asking questions. Listening carefully. My husband had always insisted I understand everything. "Just in case," he used to say. I smiled back, calm and steady. "Good morning," I replied. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Whitaker." She nodded and picked up the phone. As I stood there waiting, I thought about the dinner table. The silence. The way my son couldn't meet my eyes. The way my daughter-in-law had spoken as if she were already in control. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. But confidence, I had learned, was often built on assumptions. And assumptions could be very expensive. When Mr. Whitaker stepped out of his office and saw me, his expression shifted slightly, respectful, attentive. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "I wasn't expecting you today." "I know," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "But I think it's time we reviewed everything." He gestured for me to follow him inside. As I walked past the glass doors of his office, I caught my reflection again, clearer this time. The same woman they had dismissed the night before. The same woman they believed had nothing left. I took a seat, folded my hands in my lap, and met his gaze without hesitation. They thought I had nowhere to go. They thought I would disappear quietly. They thought wrong. I sat across from Mr. Whitaker as he closed the door gently behind him, the quiet click echoing louder than it should have in that polished office. He took his seat, folded his hands on the desk, and studied me for a moment in a way that told me he already sensed something had shifted. I did not rush to speak. I had learned, over the years, that silence often made people reveal more than questions ever could. Finally, he leaned forward slightly and said, "What would you like to review, Mrs. Hayes?" His tone was careful, professional, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. I reached into my purse and placed a small envelope on the desk. It was worn at the edges, handled many times over the years, though rarely opened. My husband had given it to me on a quiet afternoon, years before his health began to decline. I remembered the way he had looked at me then, steady and certain, as if he already understood something I had not yet seen. "If anything ever feels off," he had said, "you come back to this." I slid the envelope toward Mr. Whitaker without a word. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the document inside. As he read, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. His posture straightened. His attention sharpened. When he looked up at me again, the polite distance in his eyes had been replaced with something more serious. "I see," he said quietly. I nodded once. "So do I." The room felt different now. Not tense. Not emotional. Just clear. He turned the document back toward me and tapped a specific section with his finger. "This," he said, "changes everything." I did not smile. I did not need to. I had already felt that shift the moment I stepped into the bank. For years, I had let others speak for me. Let my husband handle the decisions. Let my son assume things would always stay the same. But I had listened. I had paid attention. And now, for the first time in a long while, I understood exactly where I stood. "I want everything reviewed," I said calmly. "Accounts, property, legal authority, all of it." He gave a small nod, already reaching for a folder on his desk. Of course. As he began pulling documents, I let my mind drift, not backward into regret, but into observation. The small details that had not made sense before now aligned with quiet precision. The way Olivia had started making suggestions about simplifying my life. The way Daniel had stopped asking me about the house, as if it were already no longer mine to discuss. The subtle changes. The quiet assumptions. They had not been careless. They had been confident. And confidence, I reminded myself again, often came from incomplete information. Mr. Whitaker placed several papers in front of me, each one neatly organized, each one representing years of decisions I had once trusted someone else to manage. "Everything is still intact," he said. "Nothing has been transferred. Nothing has been altered." I looked down at the documents, then back at him. "And control?" I asked. He held my gaze. "Yours," he said simply. The words settled in the room with a quiet finality. "Mine. Not shared. Not assumed. Not inherited through convenience or expectation. Mine." I let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of confirmation. What I had felt the night before had not been fear. It had been the absence of clarity. And now that clarity had returned, everything else seemed smaller, manageable, predictable. "I would also like to make a few adjustments," I added. He raised an eyebrow slightly, interested now. "What kind of adjustments?" I paused, choosing my words with care, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of each decision. "I want to ensure that no one can make assumptions about what belongs to me again." He gave a faint nod, as if he had expected nothing less. "We can absolutely do that." As he began outlining the steps, the legal language, the safeguards, I listened closely, asking questions when necessary, clarifying details that once would have seemed too complex or too distant to matter. But they mattered now. Every line, every clause, every condition. Time passed quietly in that office, measured not by a clock, but by the steady rebuilding of something I had not realized I had slowly handed away over the years. By the time we finished, the sun had risen higher, casting a soft light across the desk. Mr. Whitaker closed the final folder and looked at me with a different kind of respect than when I had first walked in. "Is there anything else you would like to address today?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. There were many things I could have said, many directions I could have taken, but I had learned that not every move needed to be immediate. Some things were more effective when timed correctly. "No," I said at last, standing up slowly. This is enough for now. He stood as well, offering his hand once more. If you need anything at all, please do not hesitate to call. I shook his hand firmly. I will. As I stepped out of his office and back into the main lobby, the same teller glanced up and smiled again, unaware that the woman who had walked in earlier was not quite the same one now walking out. Outside, the air felt lighter. Not because anything had been taken away, but because something had been returned. I walked to my car, placed my purse on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. I thought about the house, the dinner table, the quiet certainty in Olivia's voice, the way Daniel had chosen silence over truth. I did not feel anger, not the kind that burns quickly and fades. What I felt was steadier, colder, more precise. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, already knowing my next step would not be rushed. They believed the story had already been written. They believed my role in it was over. I let the road stretch out ahead of me, calm and open, and for the first time since that night, I allowed myself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. I did not drive back to the motel right away. Instead, I took the long route through town, past places that had once felt familiar in a way that now seemed distant, like memories that belonged to someone else. The grocery store where I used to shop every Sunday morning, carefully choosing ingredients for dinners that no longer mattered to anyone but me. The small park where Daniel used to run ahead of me as a boy, turning back every few steps to make sure I was still there. I noticed how those memories did not hurt the way they used to. They did not pull at me or slow me down. They simply existed, quiet and contained, like photographs stored in a drawer. When I finally pulled into the motel parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment, engine idling, watching the sunlight reflect off the windshield in front of me. I thought about calling Daniel. The idea came and went quickly. There was nothing left to explain. He had already made his position clear without ever needing to say it out loud. And I had finally done the same. Inside the room, everything was exactly as I had left it. Neat, unchanged, temporary. I placed my purse on the small table and removed my coat, hanging it carefully on the back of the chair. Habits do not disappear overnight. I sat down and opened the folder Mr. Whitaker had given me, reviewing the documents again, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to see them with my own eyes, to understand each line without relying on anyone else. Ownership, authority, conditions. Each word carried weight now. Each one meant something different than it had before. As I read, small moments from the past began to resurface, not as emotional memories, but as pieces of a pattern I could finally see clearly. The way Olivia had started referring to the house as too much for you months ago, her voice light but persistent. The way she had suggested looking at retirement communities, presenting it as concern while her eyes measured something else entirely. The way Daniel had stopped correcting her, stopped defending me, stopped even acknowledging the subtle shifts happening right in front of him. It had not happened all at once. That was the part one found most striking. It had been gradual, careful, layered over time until it felt almost natural, almost reasonable. I closed the folder and leaned back in the chair, letting that realization settle. They had not forced me out. They had prepared me to leave. Or at least, they thought they had. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly. The parking lot was quiet. A few cars. A man walking his dog in slow, steady circles. Nothing remarkable. And yet, for the first time in a long while, I felt something I had not expected. Not sadness. Not even relief. Control. It was subtle, but it was there, steady and unmistakable. I turned away from the window and reached for my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found his name. Daniel. My thumb hovered over the screen for a second before I pressed call. It rang 3 times before he answered. Mom. His voice was cautious, uncertain. I could hear Olivia faintly in the background, asking something I could not quite make out. Daniel, I said calmly. I just wanted to let you know that I will be out of the house by the end of the week. There was a pause. Not long, but enough. Okay, he said finally. That sounds good. Good. The word lingered in the space between us. Not kind. Not concerned. Just convenient. I will leave everything as it is, I continued. You will not need to worry about anything. Another pause. All right, he replied. His tone had softened slightly now, but not in the way it used to when he spoke to me. This was different. Careful. Measured. As if he were speaking to someone he no longer fully understood. Thank you, he added. I almost smiled at that. Thank you. As if I were doing him a favor. Of course, I said simply. Take care of yourself. I ended the call before he could respond. There was nothing more to say. I placed the phone back on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet fill the room again. It did not feel heavy anymore. It felt neutral, balanced. Later that afternoon, I drove to a small storage facility just outside of town. The clerk behind the counter was friendly, asking routine questions, sliding a form across the desk for me to sign. I chose a modest unit. Nothing large. Just enough. Enough for what mattered. Over the next few hours, I began to move what I needed. Not everything. Only the things that held value beyond appearance. Documents. Jewelry. A few personal items that could not be replaced. Each trip was quiet, deliberate. No rush. No hesitation. By the time the sun began to set, I locked the storage unit and stood there for a moment, key in hand, feeling the weight of something shifting into place. This was no longer about leaving. It was about choosing what to take with me, and what to leave behind. As I drove back to the motel, the sky turned a soft shade of orange, fading slowly into evening. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel. They believed I was stepping aside, that I had accepted what they had decided for me. And in a way, I had. I had accepted that they no longer saw me clearly, that they had underestimated what I understood, that they had mistaken silence for weakness. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, sitting in the quiet for just a moment longer before stepping out. The air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of rain somewhere in the distance. I closed the car door gently and walked back toward my room, my pace unhurried. There was still time, and for the first time, I was the one deciding how it would be used. The next morning began earlier than I expected, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day. I sat at the small table in the motel room with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, the folder from the bank open in front of me again. Not to reread every line, but to let the weight of it settle deeper, to make sure there was no hesitation left in me. Outside, the sky was pale and quiet, the kind of morning that usually felt like a fresh start. This time, it felt like preparation. I dressed carefully, choosing the same calm, neutral colors I had always worn, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would suggest anything had changed. That was important. People tend to reveal more when they believe nothing has shifted. I picked up my phone and looked at it for a moment before dialing Olivia's number. She answered quickly, almost too quickly, as if she had been expecting something. "Margaret," she said, her tone bright, controlled. "Is everything all right?" I could almost hear the calculation behind her voice, the way she measured each word, even in something as simple as a greeting. "Everything is fine," I replied evenly. "I wanted to let you know I will come by later today to gather a few remaining things." There was a brief pause. I imagined her glancing at Daniel, perhaps covering the phone slightly, deciding how to respond. "Of course," she said finally. "That would be convenient. We will be home this afternoon." Convenient. The word landed softly, but it told me everything I needed to know. "Thank you," I said. "I will not take long." I ended the call without waiting for anything more. I did not need to hear her reassurances or her carefully crafted politeness. I already understood her position. I finished getting ready, placed the folder back into my purse, and left the room. The drive back to the house felt shorter than I expected. Familiar roads have a way of folding time, compressing distance into something almost immediate. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had. Clean, solid, unchanged. From the outside, nothing suggested that anything inside had shifted so completely. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I did not feel hesitation. I felt observation. I stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, my steps steady, my posture relaxed. Olivia opened the door before I could knock. She smiled, the same practiced smile she had worn for years, the one that suggested warmth without ever quite reaching her eyes. "Margaret," she said, stepping aside. "Come in." I nodded once and walked past her, the familiar scent of the house greeting me in a way that felt almost distant now. Daniel was in the living room, standing near the window. He turned when he saw me, his expression unreadable for a moment before settling into something neutral. "Mom," he said, "you are back. Not welcome back. Just back." "Only briefly," I replied. "I have a few things to collect." He nodded. as if that was exactly what he had expected. No questions. No offers to help. Just quiet acceptance. I moved through the house without rushing, my eyes taking in small details I might have missed before. A chair slightly out of place. A vase moved from its usual spot. Subtle changes that spoke of someone else's presence asserting itself more fully. In the hallway, I paused for just a second, my hand brushing lightly against the wall where framed photos still hung. I did not stop to look at them. I did not need to. Upstairs, the bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside. The room was tidy, but not in the way I had left it. My things had been shifted, not removed entirely, but rearranged, as if someone had begun the process of making space for something new. I walked to the closet and opened it. A few of my clothes remained, but there were gaps now, empty sections where hangers once filled the space. I reached in and selected what was left that mattered to me, placing each item carefully into the bag I had brought. No hurry, no frustration, just quiet precision. When I turned to leave, my eyes fell briefly on the nightstand. His watch was still there, exactly where he had left it. I picked it up, holding it in my hand for a moment, feeling the familiar weight of it. Then I placed it into my purse without a word. Downstairs, Olivia was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching as I walked back into the room. "Did you find everything you needed?" she asked. "Yes," I replied simply. Daniel stood a few feet away, his arms crossed now, his posture slightly more guarded than before. "Is there anything else we should discuss?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and saw not the boy I had raised, but the man who had chosen his place without ever saying it directly. "No," I said calmly. "Everything is clear." Olivia nodded, her smile tightening just slightly, as if she sensed something she could not quite define. "Good," she said. "That is for the best." For the best. I almost repeated the words in my mind, not because I agreed, but because I recognized how easily people used them to justify what they wanted. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. This time, I did not pause. I did not look around. I did not take anything more than what I had already chosen. As I stepped outside, the air felt different again. Not lighter, not heavier, just certain. Behind me, the door closed with a soft click. I walked to my car, placed the bag inside, and took one last look at the house. Not with longing, not with regret, just with understanding. They believed I had come back to finish leaving. They believed this was the end of my place there. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back, already knowing that what came next would not be what they expected. I did not return to the motel immediately after leaving the house. Instead, I drove a few blocks past it and pulled into a quiet parking lot beside a small office building that had long since closed for the day. The engine idled softly as I sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my thoughts moving with a clarity that no longer surprised me. What had once felt uncertain now felt measured. Intentional. I reached into my purse and took out the folder again, along with the watch I had taken from the nightstand. I held it for a moment, turning it slightly in my fingers, watching how the light caught the worn edges of the metal. He had always valued precision. Timing. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet understanding that the right moment mattered more than the loudest reaction. I placed the watch back into my purse and closed the folder carefully. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Whitaker again. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his tone attentive. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is proceeding as expected," I replied calmly. "I would like to move forward with the adjustments we discussed." There was no hesitation on his end. "Of course," he said. "I can prepare the documents this afternoon. Would you like to come in tomorrow to finalize everything?" "Yes," I said. "Tomorrow will be fine." I ended the call and leaned back slightly in my seat, letting the quiet settle around me again. Tomorrow. It was a simple word, but it carried weight now. Not because it marked an ending, but because it confirmed a shift that could not be undone. I started the engine fully and drove back to the motel, this time without detouring. The room greeted me the same way it had before, unchanged, neutral, temporary. I placed my purse on the table and removed the folder once more, setting it down in front of me. There was nothing left to question, only decisions to finalize. That evening passed without interruption. No calls, no messages, no attempts to reach me. I noticed that more than anything else. Not because I expected concern, but because silence often revealed more than words. They believed everything was settled, that I had accepted my place, that I had stepped aside. The next morning, I arrived at the bank earlier than before. Mr. Whitaker was already waiting for me, several documents laid out neatly across his desk. He greeted me with a nod, his expression focused. "Everything is ready," he said. I took my seat and began reviewing each page carefully, not skimming, not rushing. Every clause, every condition, every line that defined what could and could not be assumed about my life moving forward. These adjustments will ensure that no one can act on your behalf without explicit authorization, he explained. And this section here, he added, pointing to a paragraph near the center of the page, clarifies the ownership structure of the property in a way that removes any ambiguity. I read that section twice, not because it was complex, but because I wanted to feel the certainty of it settle fully. "Good," I said quietly. When I finished, I signed each document with a steady hand, placing the pen down only after the final signature was complete. Mr. Whitaker gathered the papers and placed them into a folder, securing them with a firm, deliberate motion. "It is done," he said. I nodded once. "Thank you." As I stood to leave, he added, "If there is anything further you need, please do not hesitate." I met his gaze briefly. "I will not." Outside, the air felt different again. Not lighter, not heavier, just aligned. I walked to my car and paused for a moment before getting in, looking out across the quiet street ahead. Then I reached into my purse and took out my phone once more. This time, I did not hesitate. I dialed Daniel's number. He answered more quickly than before. "Mom." There was a note of surprise in his voice now. "Yes," I said evenly. "I would like you and Olivia to be home this evening. There are a few final things we need to go over." A pause followed. Longer this time. "All right," he said slowly. "We will be here." "Good," I replied. "I will arrive at 6. I ended the call without elaborating. No explanations. No reassurances. Just information. I placed the phone back into my purse and got into the car, starting the engine with a calm, steady motion. As I pulled out onto the road, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection, not on what had happened, but on what was about to happen. They believed they had already won, that the house was theirs, that I had accepted the role they had assigned to me without resistance. But they had built that belief on incomplete understanding. An incomplete understanding has a way of collapsing all at once. The drive back felt different now, not because the roads had changed, but because my direction had. By the time I returned to the motel, the day had already begun to shift toward evening, the lights softening, stretching shadows across the pavement. I stepped out of the car and walked toward my room, my pace unhurried, my thoughts precise. Inside, I placed my purse on the table and opened it one last time, checking that everything I needed was exactly where it should be. The folder, the documents, the watch, all of it aligned. I closed the purse gently and set it down, then sat in the chair by the window, watching as the sky slowly dimmed. 6 o'clock would come soon enough, and when it did, nothing would be left to assumption. Only truth, and the cost of underestimating it. At exactly 5:45, I picked up my purse and walked out of the motel room without hesitation, locking the door behind me with a quiet, deliberate motion. The evening air had cooled, carrying a stillness that felt almost expectant, as if the world itself understood that something was about to shift. I drove steadily, not rushing, not slowing, the road ahead stretching out in a way that felt both familiar and newly defined. When I turned into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, unchanged on the surface, its windows glowing softly from the lights inside. I parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat there for a brief moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. There was no nervousness, no second-guessing, only a quiet certainty that everything was now in place. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, my pace even, my posture relaxed. This time, I did not need to knock. The door opened before I reached it. Olivia stood there, her expression composed, though I noticed the faint tightness around her eyes, the way her smile held just a fraction too firmly. "Margaret," she said, "you are right on time." "I always am," I replied calmly, stepping inside without waiting for further invitation. Daniel was already in the living room, standing near the same window he had stood by the day before. His arms were no longer crossed, but his stance remained guarded, as if he were bracing for something he could not quite define. "Mom," he said, "you wanted to talk." I nodded once and set my purse down on the table beside me. Yes, I said. I did. Olivia moved closer, positioning herself slightly beside Daniel. Not in front, not behind, but aligned in a way that suggested unity, strategy. We assumed this was about final arrangements, she said, her tone smooth. We want this to be as easy as possible for everyone. Easy. The word lingered, but I did not respond to it directly. Instead, I opened my purse and removed the folder, placing it carefully on the table. The sound it made as it touched the surface was soft, but it drew both of their eyes immediately. It will be, I said. Very easy. Daniel shifted slightly, glancing at Olivia before looking back at me. What is that? He asked. I met his gaze without hesitation. Clarity, I replied. I opened the folder slowly, not for effect, but because there was no reason to rush. Each movement was measured, precise. I removed the documents and placed them in front of them, turning them so they could read without needing to reach. Olivia leaned forward first, her eyes scanning the top page quickly, confidently. Then, almost imperceptibly, her expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Her smile faded. Her posture stiffened. Daniel stepped closer, looking over her shoulder, his brow tightening as he read. Silence filled the room, but this time it was not the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Recognition. Understanding arriving all at once. I do not understand, Olivia said finally, her voice no longer as smooth as it had been. I folded my hands lightly in front of me. You do, I said calmly. You just did not expect it. Daniel looked up at me then, really looked, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization. This says, he began, then stopped, as if the words themselves felt unfamiliar coming out of his mouth. It says exactly what it needs to say, I replied. The house, the accounts, the authority. All of it remains exactly where it has always been. Olivia straightened, her composure returning in a different form now, sharper, more controlled. There must be some mistake, she said. We were told, she stopped herself, but it was enough. I tilted my head slightly. Told what? I asked, my tone even, almost curious. She did not answer. She did not need to. Daniel stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I had not seen since he was much younger, when things did not make sense to him. Mom, he said, his voice quieter now. Why did you not say anything before? I held his gaze for a moment, letting the question settle between us. You did not ask, I said simply. The truth of it landed without force, but it did not need any. Olivia's eyes moved quickly across the page again, searching, calculating, looking for something that was not there. This changes things, she said finally. Yes, I replied. It does. I reached into my purse once more and took out the watch, placing it gently on the table beside the documents. Daniel's eyes shifted to it immediately. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else. Something quieter. Your father believed in being prepared, I said, my voice steady. He believed that clarity prevents misunderstandings. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Everything that had been assumed was now undone, not through argument, not through emotion, but through something far more final. I closed the folder slowly, gathering the documents back together with the same care I had used when I first placed them down. Then I looked at them both, my expression calm, unchanged. I will give you time to process this, I said. But understand this clearly. Nothing here was ever yours to take. The room remained silent as I picked up my purse and turned toward the door. This time, I did not wait. I did not pause. I walked out with the same steady pace I had walked in, the sound of the door closing behind me marking the end of something they had believed was already decided. Outside, the evening air felt cooler now, sharper, as if the world had adjusted to match the clarity that now existed where confusion once had been. I walked to my car, placed my purse inside, and took one last look at the house, not with attachment, but with certainty. Then I got in, started the engine, and drove away, knowing that what had shifted inside that house could not be undone. I did not drive far after leaving the house that night, but the distance I created felt greater than miles could measure. The silence inside the car was steady, uninterrupted, the kind that no longer pressed against me, but moved with me, as if it had finally found its place. I returned to the motel, parked in the same spot, and stepped out slowly, the cool air brushing against my skin in a way that felt almost grounding. Inside the room, everything remained exactly as it had been, simple and untouched, a space that asked nothing from me and offered nothing in return. I placed my purse on the table and sat down without turning on the lights, letting the dim glow from outside filter through the window. For a long moment, I did nothing. I simply sat there, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into something clear and complete. There was no rush to think ahead. No need to plan the next move immediately. That part had already been decided. What remained now was something quieter, something more final. The next morning, my phone rang earlier than expected. I glanced at the screen and saw Daniel's name. I let it ring once more before answering. "Mom," he said, his voice different now, stripped of the quiet certainty it had carried before. "We need to talk." I leaned back slightly in the chair, my tone calm. "We already did," I replied. There was a pause, longer than any before, filled with something he had not allowed himself to feel until now. "I did not know," he said finally. "About the documents. About how everything was structured." I listened, not interrupting, not offering reassurance. "That is correct," I said. "You did not know." Another pause. "Olivia thinks there might be a misunderstanding," he continued, his words careful, chosen. "She says maybe the paperwork was not updated properly after Dad passed." I almost smiled at that, not from amusement, but from recognition. The search for an explanation that did not require accountability. "The paperwork is exactly as it should be," I said evenly. "It was reviewed yesterday." He exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. I could hear the shift in him, the way uncertainty had replaced the quiet confidence he had held on to for so long. "So what happens now?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried something new. Not authority, not assumption, just uncertainty. I let a moment pass before answering. "That depends on what you believe should happen," I said. Silence followed, heavier this time, as if he had not expected the question to return to him. I do not know," he admitted. I nodded slightly, though he could not see it. "Then perhaps it is time to think carefully," I replied. "About more than just the house." He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Olivia is upset," he said. "She feels like she was misled." I stood up slowly and walked toward the window, looking out at the still morning beyond the glass. "She was," I said calmly. "Just not by me." That answer stayed in the air between us, unanswered, unchallenged. "Mom," he said after a moment, "we did not mean for things to go like this." I turned slightly, my reflection faint in the glass, my expression unchanged. "No," I said. "You meant for them to go a different way." He did not argue. He could not. Because the truth was no longer something that could be adjusted or softened. It was simply there, clear and complete. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. The question settled differently than the others. Not defensive, not dismissive, just uncertain. I considered it carefully before answering. "That is not a question you should be asking me," I said. "That is a question you should be asking yourself." The line remained quiet. I could hear him breathing, steady but uneven, as if he were trying to find something solid to hold on to. "I will call you later," he said at last, "when I have had time to think." "Of course," I replied. I ended the call and lowered the phone, placing it back on the table without any urgency. There was no satisfaction in that conversation, no sense of victory, only clarity continuing to unfold in ways that could not be undone. I moved through the room slowly, gathering the few things I had brought with me, not because I was preparing to leave immediately, but because I no longer needed to stay in a place that had only ever been temporary. My time there had served its purpose. By midday, I checked out, handing the key back to the clerk with a quiet thank you. He nodded, unaware of anything beyond the simple transaction taking place. Outside, the sky was clear, the sunlight steady and unremarkable. I stood for a moment beside my car, taking in the stillness of the day. Nothing around me had changed. And yet, everything had. I opened the car door and placed my belongings inside, then paused once more before getting in. Not to hesitate, just to acknowledge. The part of my life that had been defined by quiet endurance, by careful compromise, by believing that holding things together meant staying silent, had come to an end without noise, without spectacle, without the kind of reaction others might expect. I got into the car and started the engine, my hands steady on the wheel. The road ahead was open, not uncertain, but undefined in a way that felt entirely my own. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt exactly right. The The rest of that day unfolded without urgency, but not without intention. I drove slowly through neighborhoods I had not visited in years, not because I was lost, but because I was no longer bound to a single destination. Each street, each turn, carried a quiet reminder of how small my world had once become without me noticing. I stopped at a small real estate office just before noon, the kind of place that had been there for decades, its sign slightly faded, but its windows clean and orderly. Inside, a young agent greeted me with a polite smile, her posture straight, her voice practiced but warm. "How can I help you today?" she asked. I took a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of the question. "I am looking for something simple," I said. "Something that belongs only to me." She nodded, her expression shifting slightly as she realized this was not a casual inquiry. "Do you have a price range in mind?" she asked. I gave her a number, one that would have surprised Daniel if he had ever asked, which he never did. She did not react with surprise, only with a professional nod as she began to pull up listings on her computer. As she turned the screen toward me, I studied the options carefully. Small homes, quiet streets, places where no one would assume anything about who I was or what I owed them. I selected 3 properties to visit that afternoon, not because I needed to see them all, but because I wanted to choose, not settle. The first house was modest, a single story with a small front yard and a porch that caught the afternoon light. As I stepped inside, I noticed the quiet first. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. No voices layered over each other. No unspoken tension. Just space. The agent spoke softly, pointing out details, but I only half listened. I walked through each room slowly, my hand brushing lightly against the walls, the door frames, the edges of something that could become mine without negotiation. In the back of the house, there was a window overlooking a narrow strip of grass and a single tree. I stood there for a moment, watching how the light filtered through the leaves. It was enough. Not grand, not impressive, but enough. "Would you like to see the other properties?" the agent asked as we stepped back outside. I looked at the house once more, then back at her. "No," I said calmly. "This one will do." She blinked slightly, surprised by the certainty, but quickly recovered. "Of course," she said. "We can start the paperwork right away." The process moved smoothly. Numbers, signatures, timelines. All of it handled with the same quiet efficiency I had come to expect from people who understood their roles clearly. By late afternoon, everything was in motion. Not finalized, but certain. As I left the office, my phone rang again. This time, I did not need to check the screen. I already knew who it would be. I answered without hesitation. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice steadier than before, but still carrying something uncertain beneath it. "I have been thinking." I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, pausing beside my car. "That is good," I replied. "You said I should," he continued. "About more than just the house." I waited, giving him the space he needed to continue. I think I handled things wrong," he said finally. The words came slowly, as if he were testing them as he spoke. I did not interrupt. I did not soften the moment for him. "I should have talked to you," he added, "instead of just going along with everything." I leaned lightly against the car, my expression calm. "Yes," I said. "You should have." There was no accusation in my voice. No anger. Just acknowledgement. "Olivia still believes we can work something out," he said after a moment. "That maybe we can come to some kind of agreement." I looked out across the parking lot, my eyes steady. "An agreement requires 2 sides to understand the same reality," I said. That did not happen. He exhaled slowly, as if that answer had closed a door he had hoped might still be open. "So that is it," he asked. "You are just moving on?" I considered the question carefully. "I am not moving on," I said. "I am moving forward." The distinction was quiet, but it mattered. "There is a difference," I added. He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was softer. "I do not know what that means for us." I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition of a truth that had taken too long to surface. "That depends on what you decide to do next," I said, "not on what I allow." Silence followed, not empty, but full of something that could no longer be ignored. "I understand," he said finally. I did not reply. There was nothing more to add. I ended the call and placed the phone back into my purse, then opened the car door and sat inside. The seat felt unfamiliar in a way that did not bother me. Nothing needed to feel familiar anymore. As I started the engine, I glanced briefly at the folder resting beside me, then back at the road ahead. The house I had just chosen was not large. It did not carry history or memories or expectations. It did not require me to hold anything together or explain anything to anyone. It was simply mine, and that was enough. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove forward, not looking back, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left behind that needed to be carried with me anymore. The following morning arrived quietly, without the weight that had once accompanied every new day. I woke up in a space that was no longer temporary, even if the walls around me had not yet changed. The decision had already been made, and that was what mattered. I dressed slowly, deliberately, not out of habit but out of awareness, choosing each movement with a calm that no longer needed to prove itself. When I stepped outside, the air carried a faint warmth, the kind that hinted at change without announcing it. I drove to the new house just after 9, the keys resting in my purse with a quiet certainty that felt more real than anything I had held in years. The street was still, lined with modest homes that did not compete for attention, each one simply existing without expectation. I parked in the driveway and sat there for a moment, looking at the front door. It was plain, solid, unremarkable, and that was exactly why it felt right. I stepped out of the car and walked toward it, the sound of my footsteps steady against the concrete. When I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the silence inside was immediate and complete. Not empty, not hollow, just open. I walked in slowly, closing the door behind me, and stood there for a moment, letting the space settle around me. There were no voices here, no assumptions, no one waiting for me to explain myself or justify my presence. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and walked through each room again, not as a visitor this time, but as someone who belonged. The light moved differently here, softer, more forgiving. In the back room, I paused at the window once more, looking out at the small yard and the single tree that had caught my attention the day before. The leaves shifted slightly in the breeze, steady and unbothered. I stayed there for a moment, not thinking about what had happened, but about what had changed. Around midday, my phone rang again. I looked at the screen and saw Olivia's name. I let it ring once, then answered. "Margaret," she said, her tone controlled but tighter than before. "We need to talk." I leaned lightly against the counter, my voice even. "We already have," I replied. There was a brief pause, sharper this time. "This situation is not as simple as you are making it," she said. "There are expectations, responsibilities. Daniel is your son." I listened without interrupting, allowing her words to fill the space she needed them to fill. "That is correct," I said. "He is." "Then you understand that this affects him," she continued. "We had plans. We made decisions based on what we believed to be true." I let a moment pass before responding. "And those decisions were made without asking," I said calmly. Silence followed. Not uncertainty. Recognition. "We assumed," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Yes," I replied. "You did." There was a shift in her tone then, subtle but unmistakable, as if she were searching for a different approach, something that might still hold influence. "There must be a way to resolve this without creating distance," she said. "We are family." I walked slowly toward the window, looking out at the quiet street beyond. "Family is not defined by assumption," I said. "It is defined by respect." The words settled between us, not raised, not emphasized, but firm. She did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Daniel wants to see you," she said. "He thinks it would help." I considered that for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what the request represented. Not reconciliation. Not yet. Just an attempt to understand something that had already been made clear. "If he wants to see me, he can call," I said. "And he can decide what he wants to say." Another pause. Then, more quietly, "All right." I ended the call and placed the phone back on the counter, my hand resting there for a moment before I turned away. The house remained still, unchanged by the conversation, unaffected by anything beyond its walls. That was what made it different. That was what made it mine. Later that afternoon, I returned to the storage unit and began moving. The few things I had kept. Not many. Just enough to make the space reflect something real. A chair. A small table. The jewelry box. The watch. Each item placed with intention, not to recreate what had been, but to establish what was now mine to define. By evening, The house had begun to take shape. Not fully, not completely, but enough to feel grounded. I stood in the center of the living room, looking around at the quiet, the light, the absence of expectation. My phone remained silent. No new calls, no new messages. And for the first time, that silence felt complete, not lacking. I walked to the front door and stepped outside. The sky fading slowly into evening, the air cooler now, but still calm. I looked out across the street, then back at the house behind me. Not with pride, not with relief, just with certainty. Nothing here had been given to me by assumption. Nothing here depended on someone else's understanding. It was simply mine. I turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind me. The sound final, but not heavy. Just complete.